Good afternoon. Welcome to the marking the one-year anniversary of the Russian Federation's invasion into Ukraine, a Geneva security debate on the humanitarian response. I'd like to give the floor now to Ambassador Thomas Greminger for his opening statement.
Thank you, Christina. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, friends, it's once again with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the Geneva Centre for Security Policy for this 10th edition of our Geneva Security Debates. Today's edition is entitled The Humanitarian Response, marking the one-year anniversary of the war in Ukraine. And even though this is a very sad anniversary that we are gathering here to acknowledge, we are already 1 year into this war in Ukraine. As for those of you who are loyal participants of these debates, please just bear with me for a moment. For those that are new to our discussions, please allow me to give you some background information. The Geneva Security Debates is a series of public discussions which explores pressing and current security challenges. On a monthly basis, by and large, we bring together leading thinkers, experts and policymakers for an interactive discussion on a specific challenge. In the short term, we hope that our Geneva Security Debates will help inform, provide new insights, stimulate joint reflections, and create networks among policymakers and experts here in Geneva and beyond. In the long term, we hope these debates will allow us to shape a better global future. Ladies and gentlemen, for a year now, international attention has focused on the Russian war against Ukraine. On the 24th February 2022, the world, as we have known it, was turned upside down. We are all witnessing an inflection point in history. The war's global repercussions transcend practically all aspects of our lives: political, economic, humanitarian. Particularly striking are the horrendous humanitarian costs, which we will dive deeper into during today's panel discussion. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last February, more than 18.6 billion Ukrainians have been forced to leave their homes, of which more than 8 million refugees are hosted, mostly in European countries. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded nearly 19,000 civilian casualties since the 24th of February last year. And similarly, or perhaps even more striking, are military casualties currently estimated at around 100,000 for Ukrainian soldiers and 180,000 for Russian combatants. And to give you some numbers on the global repercussions, 94% of low-income countries are struggling with skyrocketing inflation, including, for instance, Syria, which, in addition, has just experienced a severe earthquake. 20 countries are at significant risks of humanitarian emergencies and are experiencing a food price inflation of 40% and beyond. 70 million people in lower and middle income countries can no longer afford electricity. And nearly 350 million people across 79 countries are expected to experience acute food security this year. And the Black Sea Initiative, set to expire next month, which could hinder the import of 80% of grain to the African continent, including to countries like Somalia that are at the brink of famine. The focus of our panel discussion today is on the humanitarian response to the war in Ukraine, both locally and globally. But allow me, ladies and gentlemen, in the next 10 minutes to open up the discussion, at least just for a short moment, by giving you a brief overview of how I see the current state of the war, how I see potential scenarios, and very briefly, the chances of restoring a European security order. 1 year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we can say that we are currently in the fourth phase of this war. The first was the battle for Kiev in February-March last year. This was to be followed by the invasion of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions in the south, and of course the battle for the Donbass in the east. And last September we entered the third stage of this war, when Ukraine successfully started liberating important parts of their occupied territory in the northeast, in the Kharkiv region, and in the southwest as well, including regaining the city of Kherson. Today, I think we are at the fourth stage, a stage that is a pure war of attrition, a bit like the style of World War I battles that we are familiar with, where we see little or no territorial gains on either side. Still, the Russian armed forces maintain control over most of the Donbass and the south of Ukraine. Moreover, they regularly attack civilian targets throughout Ukraine with launches of missiles and drones. How long will this war last? This is certainly one of the most frequently asked questions 1 year after Russia's invasion. Since we cannot predict the future, we have to think in scenarios. And I would like to offer you very briefly 5 scenarios. The most likely scenario, at least in the short to medium term, is that this conflict will continue at high intensity. With, on the one hand, the Russian Federation trying to gain complete control of the entire Donbass region, and the Ukrainian armed forces trying to liberate as much of the occupied territory as possible. A second scenario that could well be seen as a consecutive scenario is an ongoing low-intensity conflict with a weak ceasefire or perhaps without a ceasefire agreement. This could produce a situation that is quite comparable to what we've been witnessing since 2014 in the Donbass. The third scenario, and it's unfortunately one that we cannot exclude, is the scenario of escalation. An escalation fought by conventional military means, an escalation by targeting critical civilian infrastructure of strategic relevance, either inside or outside of Ukraine. One could also imagine an escalation in cyberspace, this big cyber attack that we haven't seen yet, and eventually, unfortunately, can be totally ruled out using tactical nuclear arms, even though most experts believe this scenario to be highly unlikely. Most of them also immediately adding, you can't exclude it should the Russian president at some point face strategic defeat. A fourth scenario is that the end of the war comes by a clear military victory by one side. It's a scenario that does not seem to be very likely right now. And the fifth scenario would be that of a negotiated end of the war, a settlement that would mainly have to be negotiated between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, but it is highly likely that there are also dimensions that go beyond a bilateral settlement and would include the larger West. A negotiated end to this war would have to look at least at 2, perhaps at 4 sets of issues. Definitely at territorial issues. It would have to look at the country's future status coupled with security guarantees, And it might also have to deal with war crimes and reparations, which, as you remember, was not on the negotiation table last February, March in Minsk and in Istanbul. Will it ever be possible to restore a European security order? Even if today many predict a long war and peace talks seem too distant, I am confident that there would be ways back to a European security order that is not exclusively based on deterrence, but again would contain some cooperative elements. A security order that would not imply fueling an arms race and crowding out important investments to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, provided that the Russian Federation is at some point again ready to respect international law and other key actors in Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security would develop the political will to go down this path of, again, trying to mix deterrence with cooperative security. This is not the case today, is not very probable tomorrow, but perhaps why not after tomorrow. However, for such an ambitious endeavor, trust among key stakeholders of European security would have to be restored. And restoring trust would definitely imply an end, a negotiated end to the war that is acceptable to all relevant stakeholders. Now let me turn back to the focus of our today's discussion and perhaps also, conclude on a more positive note my introductory remarks. While the global repercussions of the war indeed seem daunting, it is encouraging to see that some leading experts and practitioners on our panel today do important and successful work in response to the humanitarian challenges that we face locally and globally. I'm very pleased to have such a distinguished panel today at the GCSP, and I would like to thank wholeheartedly Ambassador Jörg Glauber, Mark Walsh, Marie Lequin, and Myrène Bengoa for accepting our invitation and for sharing your perspectives today. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to hand over the floor to Christina Shori-Liang, our Senior Advisor of the Research and Policy Advice Department. She will introduce the speakers and she will moderate the event for us today. Again, thank you for being with us here in the room, but also online. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador Thomas Greminger, for your very clear and concise statement and giving us food for thought for this event. I will start by introducing the amazing panelists that we have here today, true humanitarian workers who've worked and done an amazing job in the field and in the world of diplomacy. So let me start with Ambassador Jörg Glauber, who's the permanent representative of Switzerland to the United Nations and to other international organizations here in Geneva. He is, throughout his diplomatic career, he's notably served as the permanent representative of Switzerland to the United Nations in New York. He was head of the United Nations and International Organizations Division in Bern, permanent representative of Switzerland to the Conference on Disarmament, and chef de cabinet to the president of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. He therefore has an extensive knowledge of multilateralism and international Geneva and is a true diplomat. Thank you for being here. Ms. Marie Lequin currently has the overall responsibility for Geneva Call in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, South Caucasus, and Ukraine. Before joining Geneva Call in 2014, she worked as country director for non-governmental and international organizations in Central and West Africa and the Middle East. Her thematic experience covers the prevention of mass violence and promotion of human rights and international humanitarian law in conflict-affected and transitioning countries. Mark Walsh, Deputy Director, Manager of Médecins Sans Frontières, and analyst focusing on Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. He has over 19 years of working experience in the humanitarian field for Médecins Sans Frontières in both communications and operations in the former Soviet space, Asia and Central Asia, and most recently in the Middle East. Before joining MSF, Mark Walsh worked as a crime correspondent and documentary filmmaker in Russia and Eastern Europe. And finally, Myrène Bengoa, who leads the Swiss foundation Chaîne du Bonheur since 2022, is known as the National Humanitarian Appeals Platform, supporting over 25 NGO partners. Previously, she was managing director at SOS Group International Action, where she oversaw the strategy and growth of 10 NGOs and 2 social enterprise incubators in more than 30 countries. She also was the executive director of the Fondation Chanel during 10 years. Myrène Bengoa is an active gender advocate and also has over 20 years of field-driven experience in women's empowerment, child health, and protection. I am really deeply impressed by this panel. I thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. I will now launch into our dialogue. So we are very much into dialoguing with our speakers. So we will start with my first question directed at Ambassador Lauber. How did the Humanitarian Geneva respond to the Ukraine crisis?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Christina. Thank you, Thomas, for having me on this very particular day. I'm not sure if I'm truly entitled to speak on behalf of Humanitarian Geneva, because it's many actors who make this international or Humanitarian Geneva, and I'm really looking forward to hear what my co-panelists have to say about their experience in the field. What I can try is to give you just a bit of a reflection or an assessment that we're making out of Geneva with my colleagues, the humanitarian experts in Geneva and in Bern. And Christina, you asked me when I came here to be your voice of hope. I'm not sure whether that's too ambitious, but in all the awfulness that we've seen since a year ago, I feel it's fair to say that the humanitarian agencies who work out of Geneva or through Geneva did a fairly good job. They responded quickly to the needs of the population in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. We also felt that they are fairly well coordinated. That is always a huge challenge. You have a big number of actors arriving. At least that's my impression. I'm looking forward to hearing from the colleagues who have more experience from the field. It was probably an advantage that many, especially the big agencies, have had a long-standing experience on the ground in Ukraine, in neighboring countries. That helped, I think, to set up or to scale up also the operation. At the same time, I think we have to admit that probably for most of us, the scale and the brutality of this war was a surprise. I mean, it had been predicted. We didn't want to believe it. I myself didn't want to believe it. And then it arrived in a way, Thomas mentioned it, we haven't seen in a long time in Europe. So the agencies, the actors, the humanitarian actors, had to really adapt to this new situation, adapt their operations, and really scale up the operations. But we feel that they've done well. Another advantage of this long-standing presence and experience was probably that they had relatively good data. That's our impression. So they knew from an early stage what were the real needs, where is what needed, and then being able to respond specifically to what's really needed on the ground, instead of what you sometimes also see in situations, humanitarian actors just throwing stuff at the situation that isn't really needed on the ground. The director mentioned some of the figures, daunting figures really, about the need on the ground. 18 million people, about 40% of the population in Ukraine who need help. 8 million Ukrainians being now having left the country, refugees. That's almost the population of Switzerland. We have a bit less than 9 million. Imagine that, the whole of Switzerland just leaving and dispersing around Europe. In the country itself, more than 5 million people. The needs are absolutely immense. And again, in response to that, if there is some silver lining in this awfulness, that the reaction also of the people of private people, of associations in Switzerland, but in many other countries, donating things, donating money, receiving also people coming. Here in Switzerland, we have 75,000 Ukrainians with status S who were received in Switzerland, obviously mostly women, children who are integrated in the school system. Again, it's 75,000, that's not quite, but almost 1% of our population. It's staggering figures. But this reaction of the people, these expressions of solidarity, I think is one of the positive elements. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for that. And just to pivot on what you just said, Miriam, I think you probably wanted to chime in on what has been the amazing wave of solidarity here in Switzerland, especially amongst Swiss NGOs.
Thank you to all, and thank you to the GCSP for this invitation. Swiss Solidarity, as many people will know it in French, is Chaîne du Bonheur. It's an old-standing institution that all Swiss citizens have seen one day or the other on TV, because we have been built from the Swiss Broadcasting Enterprise, SRG SSR, but we are now a fully independent foundation since 1983. The staggering figures that were just brought up by Mr. Ambassador are likely to showcase what paradigm shift has happened around this particular crisis. And of course, we are a humanitarian organization, so we tend to live in crisis. So Ukraine last year, it was maybe 2 months into me taking up this new role, made me really realize just how amazingly quickly the solidarity has been built. In less than 3 days, we had organized a national appeals campaign, which brought over 3 to 5 months up to 130 million Swiss francs to be donated to the Ukrainian people. For a very small country, this is an amazing wave of solidarity. And of course, it adds up to all the bilateral funding, all the in-kind donations, all the direct donations that were made by corporates, by foundations and others. So I have to say just how impressed we were as an organization by this standing ovation of people lifting their hearts. And what I was mentioning earlier is that, to me, the paradigm shift comes in for two main causes. One is that there has been this proximity of the war. People have felt a surge of empathy that possibly is different when the crisis happens much further away in contexts that are very different. But there is also this fear of a shattering of our democracies, of world peace, and this has created a shock. So that emotion has triggered this large wave of solidarity. But we're also seeing now into the year that has passed, that the economic shock that has come with the war is also leaving a strong sense of urgency with people in Europe, in Switzerland, and of course across the world, because the impacts are felt across the world. And therefore, we are held accountable as an organization very strongly into what assistance is actually being provided. And of course, it's our role to be extremely transparent with regards to what happens after the donations are made through Swiss Solidarity. So just a few key figures to give that feedback. It's close to 800,000 people who have been directly assisted through the donations that were made. About 50 million Swiss francs are already committed. And we were very cautious about not overspending in the immediate emergency moment, because we know that there were huge amounts of aid coming into not only the country, but also through institutions in the UN and other NGOs, and that we also know from experience that funding overflow can also cause harm. So we have offered our support to our partner organizations through calls for proposals, and 12 of them were previously active and have engaged further and scaled up their operations to become active in most of the regions that are now affected by the displacements of people, the destructions of buildings, and of course the disruption of essential services. So the focus of this intervention, and maybe we can speak to it a little bit further, has been to address the immediate needs of the most vulnerable populations, including single-headed households, women with young children, elderly people, and people who were already living under precarious circumstances prior to the war.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass my mic to Mark Walsh to answer the question, what are the biggest humanitarian needs and challenges in eastern and southern Ukraine?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Ambassador, for the invitation. I'd like to start by saying I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the framing of the debate. But as it is a debate, I think you would give me the license to express a couple of opinions that are a little bit counter to what has been expressed already. So first of all, I'd like to say that this is not a one-year anniversary. This is 9 years. The war started in February 2014 with the beginning of the annexation of Crimea. MSF has been working on the front lines since then. And we have had to consistently on both sides of the front line until 2015, and we continued to work on the front line until the war escalated in February of last year. And then we needed to take a step back and analyze how useful we could be. We were not straight away fit for purpose for addressing all of the needs. We could draw on our experience of what we had been doing in the previous years, but the sheer scale of the war meant that we needed to just reflect, keep in mind that Ukraine has got a very sophisticated health system. It's not broken, it's under immense strain, but we as MSF, our obligation is to look where the gaps are, where we can fill in, where we can assist and not necessarily overlap. The second thing that I'm uncomfortable with is the absence of Ukrainian participation in this debate. I think it's good to look at what Geneva's contribution to the humanitarian situation is in Ukraine, but a self-assessment, honestly, I'm uncomfortable with that. The fact is that the heavy lifting in Ukraine is done by Ukrainian organizations, Ukrainian civil society organizations, and they are badly underfunded. I'm sorry, but one statistic, less than 1% of the funding from February to October of last year went to local organizations. And this is because there's financial due diligence, obligations by donors, making it very hard for the small NGOs in Ukraine to be able to compete for money. And as a consequence, they are underfunded, and that hits on their effectiveness. Back to MSF. What we're seeing on the ground, of course, we want to talk about patients, is medical needs. We're seeing war wounded. We're working on evacuations. We're seeing a population with non-communicable diseases, diabetes, respiratory, hypertension, who are going sometimes weeks and months without access to their medication. Of course, the needs are greatest along the front line, where medical facilities have been destroyed. But in those areas which have been retaken by Ukraine, in Kherson, in Kharkov, what we've seen is total devastation. And we have seen massive needs in mental illness, anxiety, panic attacks, elderly people, children who have been made homeless, have been displaced. So we focus on war wounded, we focus on NCDs, we focus on mental health, we focus on physiotherapy for those who have suffered war-related trauma in the post-acute phase, working on physiotherapy because that's a need that we've been able to identify that is not as sophisticated in Ukraine. But I don't want to take away from our Ukrainian colleagues in the civil sector, in the medical sector who are doing a phenomenal job.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for also raising some of these very valid points. Marie, the floor is yours. Lecoin, I would like to ask you, why does Geneva Call disseminate international humanitarian norms among fighters in Ukraine? And how do you do this to ensure better compliance? And why do you think this is necessary? And perhaps just give us a sort of an overview of Geneva Call as an organization.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you to the GCSP for that event. I think humanitarian action is not always discussed, and I think it's important because we face many security and political challenges that I hope we will try to all highlight on today. So Geneva Call works on enhancing the respect of international humanitarian law among fighters. But what is international humanitarian law? Very often it's not known, among ordinary people like we are. So in armed conflict, there are rules that parties to the conflict have to stick to, and they are all about protecting civilian objects, but also those who fight. So it's about having a sense of humanity in war. We are all very shocked by what we hear, what we see on our television, but let's keep in mind that despite the scale of violence, some measures are taken by both sides, Russia and Ukraine, in planning, launching and executing military operations. It's not enough. It's not enough. There's a lot of work to do in terms of training, dissemination of the existing norms. So the Geneva Conventions, I need to mention this here because we are talking from Geneva. So a lot of work needs to be done. There are many violations which are being perpetrated today. Everything we see, we hear on the television is not necessarily a war crime. There are violations which we also need to better understand where they come from. Are they deliberate? Are they collateral damage? Are they due to a lack of knowledge of what the Geneva Conventions say? So we need to understand this, and we need to, when I'm saying we, there are other organizations promoting international humanitarian law, of course the ICRC, there are UN organizations. So it's important we understand where the needs are. And I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and when we talked to the soldiers, the fighters on the front line, they have very good, pertinent questions. Where can what can I use as a barrack for my soldiers in the night? It's -10. Where can they sleep? How can I take a private property? So they are asking many questions. They need the information. They were like a mass call for the mass mobilization, spontaneous movement of civilians joining, the military. But they don't know what international humanitarian law is about. And we need to do that training. And these activities will, of course, impact the delivery of humanitarian aid that MSF and any other organizations will be doing and are doing.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to also highlight that our associate fellow here at the GCSP is the founding mother of Geneva Call, Elizabeth de Crey Warner. Just an aside. I'm now going to pass the floor to Ambassador Lauber again. How does Geneva relate to the humanitarian principles and IHL, and how does it play a role?
Thank you much. I just want to pick up where Marie left off. Geneva obviously is the birthplace of international humanitarian law, and I think all of us living in Geneva, having an interest in these world affairs, have a special sensibility to that, a bit of pride also, but that comes also with a particular responsibility, I think, for all of us to stand up for international humanitarian law. And this is, of course, particularly true for Switzerland and the Swiss government. We are the depositories of the Geneva Conventions. We are the host state to the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And here, I'm afraid, Christina, this is where I'm turning really gloomy. in all this awfulness of this war, whether we look at the last year or the last 9 years, and I'm also very conscious this is not the only armed conflict going on, but here again and in particular, what we see are systematic, large-scale, willful violations of international humanitarian law, the countering of IHL violations by more IHL violations, and this will lead us down a path to the loss of all humanity, and I'm really concerned about that. Because unchecked violations of international humanitarian law, on the one hand, of course, immensely increase the human suffering in an armed conflict, but they also make conflict much more costly because civilian infrastructure is being destroyed. And it also makes it much harder to get out of a conflict. The level of cruelty, of disregard for the basic rules will make it much harder to get out of the conflict, much harder to reconstruct societies, and much harder to reconciliate parties to the conflict. So I believe that reversing this trend, getting back to more respect of international humanitarian law, is a huge responsibility, and we really need to increase our efforts in this regard.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that point. I'm now going to pass the floor to Mark. Mark, how have your operations adapted to the humanitarian and medical needs over the past 12 months? I know you've been there several times and watched exactly what is happening on the ground, so I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Actually, I'm not deputy director, I'm deputy program manager, just in case the deputy director is watching. I'm not trying to steal his mantle. I've been back to Ukraine 5 times since February of last year. MSF is very privileged in that we have independent funding. We're not donor dependent, so we're not answerable to a donor. That gives us a lot of flexibility in deciding what we want to do, how we want to go about it, and if it's not working, to change. Whereas many organizations that are locked in with donor funding are on a one-way street that doesn't have the agility or the ability or the permission of the donor to change direction when those needs no longer need to be addressed. And that's one of the problems that we have in Ukraine with donor-related funding, that those on the ground who are in the best position to determine when a situation has changed, and we're talking about rapidly changing front lines, don't have the agency or the freedom to be able to redirect their programming. For us, we're constantly involved in an exercise of trying to anticipate what's going to happen next and how we're going to be able to respond to it. Is the front line going to move in this direction? Is territory going to be retaken? We have our experience now from Kherson, from Kharkov. What can we expect? We can expect elderly people who've gone weeks, if not months, without medicine. We can expect huge levels of mental illness. But we can also expect massive mine and bomb contamination, so huge security concerns to take into consideration. So if I give you an example, so with retaken territory, our priority is to set up ambulatory posts so that we can diagnose, refer people quickly to secondary health structures in collaboration with the Ministry of Health. And this takes a lot of networking, this takes a lot of negotiating in advance, that you've got the trust of the local actors, of the local authorities, to be able to occupy that space. So we are also challenging ourselves to be agile enough to be able to meet those responses in a timely manner, because quite often when territory is regained, there's also a limited amount of time to be able to respond in an effective manner. Likewise, if the front line moves and you west and you have people who are displaced, how do you quickly go about ensuring, from a medical point of view, that they have the shelter, that they have the access to medicines, that they have access to therapists? Another thing I forgot to mention what we are doing, and that is that we because there are so many competent medical personnel in Ukraine, a lot of what we do is logistics and supply. So we put a lot of resources into winterizing health structures, temporary accommodation centres in anticipation of the winter. But then we had to double down, triple down when the strategy changed in October to one of degrading the electrical system, with the intention of freezing people to death, ultimately. So then we had to invest a lot more in winterization, making health structures and temporary accommodation centres more robust to be able to endure the winter. And we have had a focus on the most vulnerable people, which is elderly, homes for elderly, homes for people with disabilities, psychiatric hospitals that are not always in the first line for receiving assistance and support.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass the floor now to Marie Lecoin. You mentioned the importance of IHL and how we need to get better compliance. How has better compliance of IHL laws contributed to unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid in Ukraine? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Oh, how it could. I would rephrase the question. If we go into the details of the Geneva Convention and if they were better respected, of course, the delivery of humanitarian aid would be much, much easier. And there are very basic examples, respecting the Red Cross. I mean, the emblem. When a humanitarian convoy is approaching, when negotiations have been made for the convoy to go through, the agreement needs to be respected. And there are many provisions. Don't shoot at a doctor, don't shoot at a nurse. I mean, respect the emblem. The necessity to not deploy a military checkpoint outside of a hospital or a military position nearby. I don't know, another hospital. This is so important. And a military checkpoint outside a hospital can turn a hospital into a targetable object. And the consequences are dire for the people inside the hospital, but for also the continuation, the mid-term, long-term functioning of the hospital. And one other effect is that humanitarian workers' organizations feel, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to access the front lines because they may be targeted at any time. So there are many aspects, there are many provisions in the Geneva Convention that, of course, they need to be promoted further, and compliance is required. And I agree very much with what Ambassador was saying just before, that there is a lack of compliance. It's hugely significant, and the impact is terrible on civilian casualties, but also humanitarian workers. And the ways organizations are navigating these challenges is efficient to the extent it can be, but sometimes we are then lacking neutrality because, we need to find alternative solutions, working through volunteer movements, and this is raising another set of problems. So if we can enhance international level advocacy, political pressure, so that there is, better respect of the principles, that would be important. And one last point maybe is that as humanitarian organization, we also need to be principled. There are humanitarian principles that we need to stick to. We need to be impartial, we need to be independent. That's also very important because it's our self-protection as well. And we need this respect, so international, local organizations also need to do their homework.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to push you a little bit on that idea that you had mentioned, that some international NGOs and international organizations sometimes believe that they need to resort to local volunteers to deliver the last mile of humanitarian assistance to civilians near the front. line that this jeopardizes humanitarian principles. Can you explain where the concern is and how it can be mitigated?
So when you are on the front line, I mean, to go to the last mile, to reach individuals who have decided to not leave or cannot leave because they are too vulnerable, because they don't have any money to escape, assistance is needed. But physically, I mean, it's war. I mean, it's a high-intensity war, so physically it's almost impossible to go. So these national volunteer movements do exist. Some organizations work through these volunteer movements. Sometimes these volunteers wear green khaki. Sometimes they work with the military. They also provide assistance to the military. But what other options exist? Can we criticize that Ukrainians are seeking and trying to assist where we cannot? So how can we work around these challenges? How can we explain to these volunteers that, yes, your work has enormous value. We need also to work together. But what about distinction? How can you make sure that you're not mixed up with the military? Could you avoid wearing green khaki? Can we find distribution points which are a bit away from the military? So there are practical measures, and let's work together. I think we shouldn't be in a position where we judge, how Ukrainians are trying to assist those who are still there and who have decided to stay. So we need to, I'm going back to some humanitarian principle, we need to go back to this principle because they protect civilians, they protect humanitarian workers, and they also protect those who fight. So I think this needs to be put at the heart of humanitarian interventions. And I'm really hoping as well that, within the political sphere, we can insist on those very basic principles.
I'm now going to go back to Miriam for your insights on what are some of the challenges of offering humanitarian assistance.
First and foremost, I would like to pay tribute to the incredible work of international, local, and of course community-based organizations that are active to support populations in need. For that purpose, we also try and attempt to be an agile donor, flexibly funding these organizations, of course, initially through the Swiss NGOs that are already accredited with Swiss Solidarity. And they, of course, have a large network of local and more implemented in the local communities through their partners. So one particular challenge is the scale of the needs. Of course, you mentioned it earlier, the access. Security has been one, and the different phases of intervention that we have needed to address. In the early days of the crisis of the war, and again, I will completely destroy the myth that we distribute food items and parcels and blankets. Of course, that was urgently needed when people were on the move, when they were crossing through Poland and were lacking, but most of them had their suitcases with them. So carrying more was not an option. Delivering hygiene kits was not necessarily the best option either. Against most people's usual perceptions, humanitarian assistance in the 21st century is about delivering cash. And how do we deliver that cash? From the donor's contribution to us, through the most agile system, down the way to people on the move, fleeing Kherson, Kharkiv, and other places. Well, those NGOs have really changed their operational modalities. They managed to deploy, even though hiring is one of the key challenges because a lot of the qualified personnel has left or is now disrupted by the mobilization instructions, and all the men are currently combating. So what happens with the organizations? And of course, the lack of direct funding to local partners is one of those challenges, what we call localization of funding. But to pay tribute to them, I want to mention the work of some of our organizations. Of course, in rebuilding destroyed buildings and shelters, providing safe shelters in eastern Ukraine. EPER, HEX has been working very actively. Helvetas has been providing reconstruction of water and sanitation infrastructure, especially in those cities that we mentioned earlier. And even in the occupied territories, Save the Children Switzerland has managed to get to the other side to deliver in the most urgent needs, which were delivering coal for emergency energy purposes. We also have, and it's one of our strengths, is to be able to fund a variety of intervention categories, including what I mentioned earlier, which is the cash distribution, which has been led at a large scale by Caritas, EPER, and the Swiss Red Cross and their partners, the Ukrainian Red Cross as well. But of course, health is not forgotten, education in emergencies either, and we want to set a special focus on protection of women, of children, of people on the move, because this is indeed a high-risk environment for human trafficking, for abuse, and of course, psychosocial support is essential in ensuring that we can safeguard the affected populations through to the best location they can stay in at a later stage. And I just want to mention a last challenge, which of course we all face, and Marie mentioned it, is that we're in a highly politicized environment. Maintaining neutrality, impartiality, and independence is one of the key issues. What we did not yet mention at this moment on the panel is, what about local authorities? What role are they playing? And in fact, local Ukrainian and national Ukrainian authorities are active in ensuring that coordination, in providing the needs assessment. And for instance, for cash distributions, the lists of the populations will be vetted locally through the municipalities, and ensuring that we do this on the basis of equitable and properly coordinated assessments. Yes.
Thank you, Miriam Bengoa, for those very valuable insights. I'm now going to ask the question I think that we're all wondering, wondering the most, is MSF able to work on both sides of the front line? Are you able to provide assistance to people living in areas under Russian military control?
The short answer is no. We actually were working on both sides up until the end of February last year. It's a short recap. In 2015, we worked on both sides of the front line, and then we were asked to leave in late 2015 from the so-called Donetsk People's Republic. We were accused of organ harvesting, we were accused of spying, we were accused of a number of things. We left. We continued to work on the Ukrainian controlled side. Our base was in Mariupol until February of last year. We spent 3 years negotiating with the people in charge in Donetsk, knowledgeable that we were also having to, through them, negotiate with others. And in 2018, we had some success. We got permission to operate a hepatitis C program on the other side, so step by step. That concluded in December of 2021. And we were in the process of negotiating a prevention of cervical and breast cancer program in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic when the war escalated in late February of last year. Since then, we have had no success whatsoever in being able to negotiate either cross-line, in other words, across the contact line, which is a very hot front line, or cross-border. Now, this is something very controversial in Ukraine. It's not received very well. It's by civil society, less so by the authorities. It's like, why do you want to work where the enemy is? Why do you want to work with those people that are proactively supporting the Russians? Well, we don't see it like that. We see it through the lens of medical people looking at people who are patients, who are vulnerable, who need assistance. So for us, it remains a priority to try and work across the front line, but without security guarantees from both sides, which we have not been able to achieve from the Russian side, it is too dangerous simply to risk trying to drive a convoy of assistance. It's not possible to assess there to know what the needs are. And we don't really have an interlocutor. I mean, we have done outreach, but we don't really have an interlocutor, and after 12 months we have not made any real significant progress in being able to negotiate access. That said, we do know that in retaken territory, when we go there, the needs that we see testify, unfortunately, to the fact that for the previous time under Russian occupation, there has been a dearth, an absence of humanitarian assistance based on the condition of the patients, based on the conditions of the medical structures. I will add, and again, this is also controversial, we work in Russia and we work in Belarus. Up until when the war escalated in February of 2022, we had a tuberculosis program in Arkhangelsk, a multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis program in Arkhangelsk. And we're not going to stop that because Russia goes to war. I mean, why would we punish the patients in Russia because the Russian government decides to go to war? Likewise, we have a tuberculosis program in the penitentiary system in Belarus, and we're not going to stop that either. We are endeavoring to provide assistance to people who have been displaced for whatever reason from Ukraine into Russia, because we see them as people who had to leave their homes. We don't question why, we don't question their allegiance. It's been difficult, it has not been of any great significance, but we continue to engage, or try to engage, with the Russian authorities, and I hope I'm proved wrong, because so far we haven't seen a huge interest or a huge desire for independent actors to operate on the occupied territory. So yeah, that's the answer.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm going to pass the same question to Marie Lacroix.
Its access is very difficult to the Russia-controlled territory. I will echo what Mark was saying. Let's keep trying. Let's never stop. Let's be, principled organization. Let's use all the different leverage we have. And we should never stop on asking, to have that direct access, physical access. The nature of the work of Geneva Call is different. I mean, when we talk about access, we don't talk about, trucks and convoys, so it's much lighter. We do maintain the dialogue. We do talk to the Russian. And I'm making an appeal here. I hope that the donor community can understand that we need to talk to Russia. That has a cost. It requires humans to do that, people to travel, to spend, time to try and try again. And we shouldn't stop, because people are suffering in Russia-controlled territory. Humanitarian needs are dire and they need to be addressed. These people have not chosen to be at war. They suffer from the war as Ukrainians do. It's not always easy to make these points understand in Ukraine, that we also need to have humanitarian assistance delivered on the Russia-controlled territory. So here, there's a need for relief organization to communicate on the importance of humanitarian principle. So that's quite essential as well. I wanted to add, and it's a bit connected on the point Miren was mentioning about the role of local authorities, which is a bit ambiguous sometimes because it's a martial law. So there are, it's now military-driven municipalities. So that makes the work very challenging, and that's on both sides of the front line. Who are you talking to? By talking to authorities which have a double hat, who are you talking to? Are you losing in terms of neutrality? How do you protect humanitarian action in that context? So here I think at the very high level, there is some advocacy that is still needed so that humanitarian aid is protected. So that's quite essential. Yeah.
Thank you, Marie Lacroix. I'm now going to pass the floor to Ambassador Lauber. I wanted to ask you the big question. What is the role of Switzerland in all of this?
Thank you. I'm not sure whether that's a particularly big question, because I think we are just part of a huge community in this international realm that tries to make a contribution. It's not a beauty contest. Some of the figures were mentioned. We were, of course, very happy to see that this week the government decided an additional package, 140 million Swiss francs contributions. We mentioned what the people of Switzerland individually did, contributions, again, receiving people coming from Ukraine. Maybe two more points, or a couple more points. One is that I think there is a very clear awareness, especially in the government, and Foreign Minister Cassis mentioned it again at several opportunities this week in talks with the media, that this doesn't stop here. As sad as it is, and I think Thomas in his scenarios made it clear for everybody, this crisis, this war, and the implications in Ukraine, in Europe, elsewhere in the world will continue for a while. And we are aware of that, and we are aware that Switzerland will be among the countries being called upon to continue contributing to the needs of Ukraine now, but also especially to the needs of Ukraine in the future, when hopefully soon the moment of reconstruction will come. I mean, the reconstruction is already starting, but it will become much more bigger, much more intense, much more costly once the conflict ends. And with this in mind also, that the foreign minister launched this Lugano conference, which some criticized as being too early, but it's never too early to start talking about the perspectives, principles of reconstruction, and this will continue. Another point I want to make is, and I think Thomas, others mentioned it, Ukraine is a terrible tragedy, but we have many other humanitarian crises around the world, not least what we just saw in Turkey and Syria happening, but many other parts of the world. And our aid to Ukraine is not at the expense of what we do in these other parts of the world. It's in addition, and it's very important that all of us keep in mind that there are terrible situations all over the world that need our attention. And then maybe the last point I want to mention is the role of Geneva as a space and a place where everybody can come and discuss how to address this situation. Here, GCSP is a prime example. Many discussions around the war in Ukraine take place in many different configurations. I know, Thomas, that I don't know everything you're doing, but things are happening all over town. You know, the war in Ukraine has an impact on discussions we have in multilateral fora, whatever the issue, be it health, labor, human rights, humanitarian aid, and this is happening. And in this sense, Geneva is open for business, if I may say it that way, and we support that, of course. You mentioned the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Some of these negotiations are taking place here. So I think these are some of our contributions. But again, we are just part of a much bigger picture where we are trying to make our contribution, bear our share. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I am now going to ask Mark one more question about the healthcare system. I know you recently met the Minister of Health in Ukraine. How bad is it, the Ukrainian health system now due to the war?
I met the deputy health minister, or one of the deputy health ministers, about 3 weeks ago, and I met the minister a few months before that. The system is under a lot of strain, but it's still functioning. But particularly along the front line, access to healthcare is particularly difficult. Structures have been targeted. Our colleagues in MSF Belgium will be bringing out a report in early March, which will be documenting the destruction of healthcare facilities in the 5 frontline oblasts where we work. So I'll share with Christina, she could share that further with you when it's publicized. Yeah, many factors, of course. The shift in strategy from October of last year on the electrical system, and in turn the hot water system, and in turn the connectivity has had an impact on hospitals' of capacity to be able to function. They have received a lot of support from donors, from governments. At one point I heard there was 800 generators crossing the border a day in the form of assistance. But at the same time, the medical professionals have had to triage and to prioritize different types of surgery. Medical personnel have had to flee. They're also humans. They also have their families. They also have their houses which have been shelled, which have been destroyed, and they have had to move. So again, closer to the front line, you've seen a decrease in the availability of the HR factor, if you like, of medical personnel. But it's still functioning, and the collaboration with the Ministry of Health, with medical actors, to the best of my knowledge, is very, very good. I just wanted to touch on the last question that Christina asked the ambassador, and that is about the collateral impact of the war on other contexts. You know, for a while there was a debate around why are Ukrainians getting VIP treatment in Europe and others are not getting treated so well. I would argue that the bar that's been set for Ukraine is the bar that should be aspired to, and the bar shouldn't be lowered for some sort of more equitable distribution of which are not finite resources, as we very well know. But I will highlight very quickly what for MSF are the main issues that are of huge concern to us right now, and that is that there's a massive increase in cholera, and that needs to be addressed, and obviously that cannot be addressed without sufficient funding. Food insecurity, clearly exacerbated by the annexation of most of the Black Earth belt of southern Ukraine, and the rocketing prices of grain. Afghanistan is in an extremely situation. Massive food insecurity in the Sahel. And as I think the ambassador mentioned, the impact of the earthquake, particularly in Syria, where it's so difficult to get humanitarian assistance. And it's very important to keep these issues, and there are others, of course, it's not an exhaustive list, to keep these on the radar and to keep on finding ways to address them.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to highlight for everyone here, we had a Geneva security debate on the Sahel in cooperation with GCSP, and there's an interesting, I think, video that you can look at on looking at especially the human insecurity that is there and the rise of extremism and violence and conflict. I now, I think, will give you all the chance to ask this esteemed panel to raise some questions that you have. Before I begin, let me just do a GDPR disclaimer. We will now start the Q&A session. Please note, as this is a public discussion, the Q&A might be subject to recording, transfer, and posting on social media. If you do not wish for your name and or position to appear, you may refrain from introducing yourself when asking your question. So, who would like to begin? Please.
Hello.
You have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Nadia Alarian. I'm president of Association Ukraine Reborn, which is a grassroots Swiss Ukrainian sport association, humanitarian association that functions since the beginning of the war. And it is really great to see the discussion on such a high level in the Geneva Security Policy Center. I have questions to all the speakers, but I will focus on one, and I have a lot of comments. First comment is a great thanks to Mark for outlining what I think is extremely important, is giving an opportunity also for Ukrainian side maybe to feedback on what's being said and give the perspective, and now a huge thanks to international community for support. However, I also support and I believe the scenario that sooner or later the war will finish, and we hope that it will be sooner than later. And certainly there is already a lot of discussion about the reconstruction of Ukraine that is going to happen. We believe that we will reacquire all our territories that are being occupied now. And of course, we are talking about economic reconstruction. We are talking about facilitation of cooperation between Swiss and Ukrainian businesses, and this is all great. However, when we talk about it, we also need to remember about the security aspect of everything, right? Because when we are talking about attracting the investments, when we are talking about the money flowing into the country, it would be extremely important to understand how do we guarantee that this money would not be spent in vain and blown up tomorrow, in simple language. So it would be amazingly valuable to see the position of the experts at Geneva Security Policy on this behalf. And actually, as Ukraine Reborn Association, we are launching the project on, that is also connected to the reconstruction, where we're inviting global research institutions to give their perspectives. And of course, we would be very happy to cooperate also with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy on that. But maybe you can give a little bit of outlook already now on how do you see security aspect of reconstruction of Ukraine once the curtain is up, so to say. Thank you.
I think I can pass that question to Ambassador Lauber. Please go ahead. Thank you for that. Thank you for those beautiful words.
Thank you, pass it on to the director. But thank you so much for this remark, and I think that was precisely the idea also of the Lugano conference, which, by the way, was really prepared in very close cooperation with the Ukrainian government. It's not us, Swiss government, coming to tell you what to do, but together and then with the 40 partner governments and many organizations start thinking about what would be the orientations and some guidelines. It was not a classic donor conference trying to create funds. That was a part of the discussion, but exactly what you're saying. When now we start, what should be some of the rules and principles. They adopted a set of these principles to make sure that reconstruction then is as effective as possible. I think exactly that line. Thank you. Yeah.
Ambassador Greminger, you have the floor.
The question of the future status and the security guarantees given to Ukraine is, of course, one of the fundamental issues that would have to be sorted out and agreed to. And I think if we want to have a sustainable peace, then this question will have to be dealt with. In theory, it's not impossible to find a solution. In practice, it is very challenging. And, you know, just if you look at negotiations that have been held in the very beginning of the war, February, March, there were in Minsk and in Istanbul negotiations, and there is this famous communique, this Istanbul communique of I think it's the 29th of March, that outlines basically some sort of a neutrality status in return multilaterally agreed security guarantees, right? And this was apparently negotiators on both sides said this was a common understanding, an agreement. Unfortunately, other issues were not yet agreeable. And then a couple of weeks later, and definitely after Busha, this understanding kind of fell apart. And today we are miles away from a common understanding. And I think when we talk about security guarantees today, what you can read in this in this Kiev Security Compact comes relatively close to what is the mainstream thinking in Kiev and in the West. Of course, this is not something that would be acceptable to the Russians. It is basically supporting Ukraine in defending itself to a very wide extent. Often this is referred to the Israel model, so basically giving Ukraine whatever has been given to Israel in order to protect itself. But it would be short of Article 5 guarantees of the Washington Treaty. This, of course, is what President Zelensky, the current Ukrainian government, would like to achieve. Now, I'm pretty sure on the other side, there is still this quest for guarantees that Ukraine will never become a NATO member, right? So this is to say that this is going to be a tough one to sort out. But obviously, it's very legitimate that Ukraine wants security guarantees that are better than the Budapest Memorandum. But you know, to a certain extent, one can also understand that there are some legitimate security concerns on the Russian side that Russia would not want to have at their border missile systems that could reach St. Petersburg and Moscow within a couple of minutes. And so, you know, I'm just saying that this is going to be no, let me conclude by saying we've been, from last April on, working on these issues with leading experts. We are currently preparing a dialogue that would bring together Ukrainian security experts together with Western security experts, because there seems to be a strong sense on the Ukrainian side to have more clarity of what they can expect from the West in terms of security guarantees. And that is, if everything goes well, that's going to happen relatively soon here.
Please go ahead.
The analysis that was provided now gives an amazing lecture of what the big diplomatic political issues are. I would just want to highlight also the vital importance and shift from the civil society perspective, and to value the importance of the resistance that is occurring right now in Ukraine, and the accountability that the Ukrainian people is holding their own government to with regards to the negotiations going on for the future of the country, and also negotiating a clear path for a real future, including democratic principles, respect for all human rights, including women's rights, and of course the fight against all criminal activities that might also be draining some of the credibility in certain regions. So what we would hope for as a humanitarian actor in all this is to ensure that the voices of the people are heard in all these future negotiations, whether through whatever you call them here, track 1, 1.5, 2 tracks, but making sure that you get the right people at the table, and including those community organizations which have been at the forefront of the response.
Thank you so much. I also wanted to ask all of you, in terms of the war, has technology in a way helped or hindered the humanitarian response? Have you been able to access different types of tech to help people in need? Does anybody want to answer that?
On our perspective, it has some added values, but many downsides. Working around the promotion of international humanitarian law is super sensitive. IHL is becoming politicized, which is a problem, a huge problem. And the role that the media are playing, social media, is, as everyone knows, yeah, it's fueling the conflict. So we do use technologies to reach those who cannot reach physically, but it's not always possible. And we also face, counter narratives. But I guess, this is a problem that we face in many other contexts. But knowing how politicized the crisis is in Ukraine, the impact on humanitarian action, of course, is quite severe. But we are very, our work is very much about talking. So maybe for those who have more concrete response, maybe Mark.
Well, certainly in communications, advances in technology have been particularly beneficial from us, and I don't want to advertise any particular satellite companies, but we do use satellite technology, obviously. We have employed solar panels. We've put solar panels onto medical structures, particularly along the front line, to make them more energy independent in the eventuality that there are power outages. But I'd say the reverse is also true, that we've had to go back to basics when there's an absence of technology due to the degradation of the electrical system, that we have been providing people in temporary accommodation centres with manual battery chargers. We've been using diesel generators. We've been using headlamps in hospitals. So it's plus and minus.
Thank you so much. We're starting to run out of time, so I wanted to give all of you one more chance to summarize some of the points, the key points that you wanted to deliver today. So perhaps we'll start with you, Miriam Magoa.
Thank you. I think the voice I want to bring to the table, and again, thanks for the invitation, is that solidarity is a value that has now been, again, showcased to the world as so important, that it can be incarnated in many different ways. It is channeled through communications tools, but it also channeled through example and action. And we want to make sure to continue that it can find its expression. We also wanted, in this particular circumstance of Ukraine fighting for its freedom, to ensure that all generations are feeling concerned by this issue, that they also realize that all this is built on a century of peace building and establishing rules for international cooperation. And this is also a lesson for younger generations.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass the floor to Marie Lacroix.
Ukraine is in a situation of armed violence, which, as the director was mentioning, is really high intensity, where we face fightings in trenches like back 100 years ago, and at the same time the use of super high-tech weapons. There are individuals behind all these weapons, and I think we shouldn't forget them. We're talking a lot about the civilian, but I think we also need to remember that there are many soldiers dying, and that there are, the wounded, the sick, the prisoners have rights, and that the humanity, the solidarity we are trying to bring in today is also, to them, to their family. Because we talk about now hundreds of thousands of dead. And again, international human rights law is also about protecting these people who fight.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the floor now to Mark Walsh.
Well, as this will be my last few words, thanks again for the invitation to be able to share with you what we're seeing, what we're doing, how we analyze things with respect to this war. So I'm not going to go through a list of wounded and morbidities. What I would just like to accent is to that Médecins Sans Frontières remains committed to providing medical humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. MSF Swiss, we completed a strategy plan for 2023. And as far as one can prepare a strategy, of course, when you don't know what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, never mind in the next 12 months, but we do need to plan. And we do also plan when the war is over to remain in Ukraine and to address many what will be post-war, but also on-war related medical issues, as we were doing previously, whether that's prevention of cancer, of cervical cancer, breast cancer, whether that's hepatitis C, whether that's drug-resistant tuberculosis, projects which are much more difficult to run, but are still justifiable, of course, but when there is a war going on.
Thank you, Mark. And I just wanted to highlight that Mark Walsh is also an alumni of the GCSP. He took the New Issues in Security course, and we're delighted to have him here on the panel. I'm now going to pass the floor to Ambassador Yerlauber for your last words on this panel.
And maybe two thoughts. I want to join in and share my voice, join my voice to what was said before, and really say a huge thanks to everybody who's involved in the humanitarian response to this particular crisis. Everywhere, but particularly also on the ground, the small NGOs, the local, the civil society that was mentioned, a huge and massive thank you. And then secondly, again, back to Humanitarian Geneva, humanitarian action based on humanitarian principle is really a wonderful expression of humanity and human progress, and it's under threat. And we need to really stand up for these values and principles. It's urgent. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to highlight that a lot of I've been following most of the programs that have been happening now on this one-year anniversary of the invasion of the Russian Federation into Ukraine. And a lot of the events have focused on the geopolitical situation of the war. But I wanted to really shine the light on, as Ambassador Greminger also wanted to shine the light on the humanitarian response, because we tend to forget really these angels who are really working on helping to make a more safe environment for all the hundreds and thousands and millions of refugees of the war who are threatened not only when they leave the country, but also then are trafficked and are ripe for picking for organized criminal groups. So it's a sad state of affairs. But thank you also for shining the light of hope. This side of the panel worked hard on trying to give us hope in this very dark day. But thank you so much. Before I close, I wanted to thank all the people on this who are behind the scenes in a sense, but are very much important in helping to make this event, shaping this event. I would like to thank David Sheldon, Tobias Knappe, Florian Gollet, Pontus Walston, Johan, our facilities officer, and Ines and Alice, and of course Mareva Rodri, who is part of our team in the Research and Policy Advice Department. I also wanted to thank again the panelists for coming today. I know you have a lot of work right now. It just gives me an incredible pleasure that you are here today, dedicating this time with us to share your thoughts about what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. Thank you for your bravery and thank you for your hard work. And let's give them all a big applause.